She gets the beat-up Honda, I get the portfolio. That's the deal, Brian. Make it happen. Kevin Moore thought he was the smartest man in the room, whispering confident threats, while his soon-to-be ex-wife sat silently across the aisle. He had the high-priced lawyer, the hidden assets, and the younger mistress waiting in the lobby. It was supposed to be a slaughter. But Kevin forgot one detail. He never actually read the fine print of the history books, and he certainly didn't know who his wife really was. When Judge Nicholas Foster picked up the property deed and saw the name Howard printed in faded ink, the color didn't just drain from Kevin's face, it drained from his future. You are not going to believe how hard the gavel of karma hits in this story. The champagne flute made a sharp, crystalline clink as Kevin Moore tapped it against Molly Jenkins's glass. They were sitting in a booth at the Obsidian, the most expensive lounge in the city, tucked away in a corner where the lighting was low and the leather was imported. "To liberation," Kevin said, his voice smooth, carrying the practiced cadence of a man who sold luxury real estate for a living. He adjusted the cuffs of his bespoke suit, smiling at the woman who had effectively replaced his wife 6 months ago. Molly giggled, the sound light and airy. She was 24, sharp-witted, and currently wearing a diamond tennis bracelet that Kevin had bought using a bonus check he'd hidden from the joint checking account. "Are you sure, Kevin? I mean, she looked intense at the deposition last week." Kevin waved a dismissive hand. "Paige, intense? Please. Paige is a librarian, Molly. She organizes decimals for a living. She doesn't have the stomach for a fight. She just wants it over." He took a sip of the vintage Dom Perignon. "I've got Brian Adams in my corner. The man is a shark. He's got her convinced that if she fights for the house, I'll expose her mental instability regarding her miscarriage 3 years ago. She's terrified. She'll sign whatever we put in front of her." Molly's smile faltered for a fraction of a second, perhaps a flicker of conscience, but she recovered quickly. "And the house? The lakeside property?" "Mine," Kevin said, his eyes gleaming. "I paid the mortgage. I paid the renovations. Sure, her name is on the title technically, but Brian has precedent. Contribution of funds outweighs titular claim in this state if we can prove she was financially dependent. And since she took that sabbatical to find herself last year, she has 0 income on the books." Kevin leaned back, feeling the weight of his wallet in his jacket pocket. He felt invincible. He had constructed this divorce like a masterful architectural project. He had siphoned funds into offshore crypto wallets that Brian Adams assured him were untraceable. He had gaslit Paige into believing she was lucky he hadn't divorced her sooner. He checked his watch. Tomorrow is the final hearing. Judge Nicholas Foster is presiding. Molly frowned. "Foster? Isn't he the one they call the hangman?" "He's strict," Kevin admitted, shrugging. "But he's a traditionalist. He likes facts, figures, and breadwinners. He doesn't like emotional outbursts. And Paige, well, she's been emotional lately. Brian is going to provoke her. She's going to cry. And Foster is going to look at her like a hysterical liability. By noon tomorrow, I'll be a single man, and we'll be ordering paint samples for the master bedroom." It was a seductive fantasy. Kevin truly believed that he was the protagonist of reality, and everyone else, Paige, the judge, even Molly, were just supporting cast members. Meanwhile, 10 miles away, in a small, rented studio apartment that smelled faintly of lemon polish and old books, Paige Howard sat at a wobbly kitchen table. She wasn't crying. She wasn't hysterical. She was reading a leather-bound journal that was over 80 years old. Her lawyer, Erin Coleman, sat across from her. Erin wasn't a shark like Brian Adams. She was quiet, methodical, and wore cardigans that made her look like a schoolteacher. But Erin Coleman had never lost a case involving land disputes. "Are you sure you want to do this, Paige?" Erin asked softly, tapping her pen on the legal pad. "Once we introduce this evidence, there's no going back. It will humiliate him, publicly. It could destroy his career." Paige closed the journal. Her hands, usually trembling with the anxiety Kevin had instilled in her for a decade, were steady. She thought about the tennis bracelet she'd seen the receipt for in the trash. She thought about the way Kevin had mocked her grief when they lost the baby. She thought about the mental instability narrative he was spreading to their mutual friends. "He wants the house, Erin," Paige said, her voice raspy but firm. "He wants the land. He told me yesterday that I was a squatter in his life." Paige looked up, her green eyes hardening into flint. "Let him have his day in court. Let him think he's won. I want him to feel the height of the fall." The courtroom preparation began long before the sun rose. For Kevin, it involved a 40-minute grooming session, ensuring his hair was perfectly coiffed to look successful, yet humble, and a pep talk with Brian Adams over espresso. "Remember," Brian said, pacing Kevin's living room, the living room Kevin was fighting to keep. Brian was a short, aggressive man who compensated for his stature with $3,000 suits and a voice that carried across parking lots. "We stick to the narrative. Paige is unstable. She contributed nothing to the estate value. You are the sole provider. We offer her a pittance of alimony for 2 years, and she keeps the car. That's it." "What if she brings up the affair?" Kevin asked, adjusting his tie. "She has no proof. Rumors aren't evidence. And even if she does, Judge Foster doesn't care about infidelity unless it affects the finances. Did you spend money on Molly?" "Cash only," Kevin lied. He hadn't used cash for the bracelet, but Brian didn't need to know that. "Then we're good. We go in, we crush her, we leave." On the other side of town, the morning was quieter. Paige Howard stood in front of the mirror in her small bathroom. She wore a navy blue dress, simple, conservative, dignified. She pulled her hair back into a severe bun. She looked at her reflection and barely recognized the woman staring back. For 7 years, she had been Kevin's wife. She had played the role of the supportive partner while he built his real estate empire. When he needed capital to start his firm, she had given him her inheritance from her grandmother, disguising it as a loan he never paid back. When he needed social connections, she had introduced him to the town's elite, though she never explained how she knew them. Kevin had never asked. That was his fatal flaw. He was so obsessed with his own reflection, he never bothered to look closely at hers. He knew her name was Paige Howard, but he assumed Howard was just a common name, like Smith or Jones. He didn't know the history of the county. He didn't know why the old library was named the Howard Athenaeum. She picked up her phone. One missed message from Kevin. "Don't make this hard on yourself, Paige. Take the deal. Brian is ready to play dirty if you don't." She deleted the message without replying. She walked out to the living room, where Erin Coleman was waiting with a heavy banker's box. "We have the affidavits?" Paige asked. "We have everything," Erin said. "And I spoke to the clerk this morning. Judge Foster is in a mood. He threw out a lawyer yesterday for being 5 minutes late. He's tired of games." "Good," Paige said, putting on her coat. "I'm tired of games, too." They drove to the courthouse in silence. As they approached the grand limestone building, Paige felt a strange sense of vertigo. This building, with its towering pillars and inscription about justice, sat on the corner of 4th and Main. "You okay?" Erin asked, noting Paige's gaze fixed on the courthouse foundation. "I'm fine," Paige whispered. "It's just irony." "What is?" Kevin thinks he understands ownership, Paige said, clutching her purse tighter. He thinks ownership is a piece of paper you file with the county clerk. He doesn't understand that some things can't be bought, and some bonds can't be broken by a foreclosure notice. They parked. As they walked toward the entrance, they saw Kevin and Bryan Adams laughing near the metal detectors. Kevin spotted her, and his smile turned into a pitying smirk. He whispered something to Bryan, and they both chuckled. Paige kept walking, her chin high. She wasn't walking to her execution. She was walking to a pulpit. The courtroom smelled of wood polish and anxiety. The air conditioning was humming too loudly, a low drone that grated on the nerves. Judge Nicholas Foster was a man carved from granite. He was 65, with silver hair and reading glasses perched on the end of a nose that had sniffed out lies for 30 years. He didn't use a gavel unless he had to. Usually, a single raised eyebrow was enough to silence a room. Docket number 4, 920, the bailiff announced. Moore versus Moore. Petition for dissolution of marriage and division of assets. Kevin sat tall, projecting confidence. Bryan Adams stood up, buttoning his jacket. Ready for the petitioner, Your Honor. Ready for the respondent, Erin Coleman said softly. Judge Foster looked over his glasses, shuffling the thick file in front of him. I've reviewed the preliminary briefs. This seems contentious regarding the primary residence at 12 Oakwood Lane. Is that correct? It is, Your Honor, Bryan Adams boomed, using his courtroom voice. My client, Mr. Moore, purchased the property, paid the mortgage, and financed the extensive remodeling. Mrs. Moore, has made no significant financial contribution to the estate in the last 4 years. We are asking that the title be transferred solely to Mr. Moore, with a fair equity buyout calculated at the pre-renovation value. Pre-renovation? Judge Foster asked, his voice dry. Why? Because the increase in value is solely due to Mr. Moore's expertise as a real estate developer. He did the work. He added the value. It was a bold lie. Paige had designed the renovation. Paige had sanded the floors herself when they couldn't afford contractors in the early days. Ms. Coleman. The judge turned his gaze to Paige's table. Erin stood up. Your Honor, we dispute the assertion that Mrs. Moore made no contributions. However, the issue of contribution is actually secondary to the issue of title legality. Kevin rolled his eyes. He leaned over to Bryan. Here she goes. Desperate stalling tactics. Bryan stood up, interrupting. Objection, Your Honor. The title is clear. It is a joint tenancy. We are simply asking to dissolve it. If counsel is suggesting the title is forged, that is a serious accusation. I am not suggesting it is forged, Erin said calmly. I am stating that the deed Mr. Moore is relying on is incomplete. Judge Foster frowned. Incomplete how? Is it signed? It is signed, Your Honor, but it conflicts with a pre-existing covenant on the land. Kevin scoffed audibly. The judge shot him a look that could have frozen water. Mr. Moore, Judge Foster warned. Do you have something to add? Apologies, Your Honor, Kevin said, trying to look contrite. It's just, my wife has a history of confusion regarding financial documents. Is that so? Foster turned back to Erin. Ms. Coleman, get to the point. What covenant? Erin reached into her briefcase. She didn't pull out a standard legal motion. She pulled out a large folded document that looked like parchment, followed by a modern deed. Your Honor, Erin said, walking to the bench. I present Exhibit A, the original land grant for the township, dated 1922, and Exhibit B, the specific deed restriction regarding the plot of land located at 12 Oakwood Lane, commonly known as the Old Miller Estate. Bryan Adams laughed. Your Honor, this is ridiculous. We are talking about a house built in 2015. 1922 land grants are irrelevant." "Not in this jurisdiction, Mr. Adams," Judge Foster said, holding out his hand. "I'll see the documents." Erin handed them up. The courtroom went silent. Kevin felt a tiny prickle of unease on the back of his neck. Why was Paige so calm? Why wasn't she looking at him? She was looking at the seal behind the judge's head. Judge Foster adjusted his glasses. He opened the modern deed, the one Kevin had signed with such pride. He read the names, Kevin Patrick Moore and Paige Elise Howard. Then he opened the older document. He read for a moment, his eyes scanning the dense, calligraphy-style script. Then he stopped. He looked closer. He looked up at Paige, then back down at the paper. The judge's demeanor changed. The boredom vanished, replaced by a sharp, predatory alertness. He looked at the modern deed again. "Mr. Adams," Judge Foster said, his voice dropping an octave, "you filed this motion claiming your client, Mr. Moore, has the superior claim to the land based on financial contribution?" "Yes, Your Honor. He paid for it." "He paid for the structure," Judge Foster corrected. "But are you aware of the ground lease terms attached to this specific subdivision?" "Ground lease?" Brian blinked. "No, Your Honor. It's fee simple ownership." "It is not," Judge Foster said. He held up the old parchment. "This entire subdivision, the Oakwood Preservation, sits on land that was never sold. It was leased in a 99-year trust by the founding family to ensure preservation of the lakefront." Kevin whispered frantically to Brian. "What is he talking about? I bought that land." "The trust," Judge Foster continued, ignoring the whispering, "stipulates that the land title remains with the direct lineal descendants of the founder. Any structure built upon it is subject to the approval of the landholder. And if a transfer is attempted without the landholder's consent, the structure's ownership reverts to the trust." The judge leaned forward, staring directly at Paige. "The founder of this trust," Foster read from the paper, "was a man named Elijah Howard." Kevin froze. Howard. Judge Foster looked at the modern deed. Paige Elise Howard. The judge looked at Kevin, his eyes narrowing. "Mr. Moore, did you know your wife is the sole surviving trustee of the land your house sits on?" Kevin's mouth opened, but no sound came out. The air left the room. I don't," Kevin stammered. "Because," Judge Foster said, a dark amusement coloring his tone, "according to this deed, you don't own that house, Mr. Moore. You are essentially a tenant, and your landlord is sitting at that table." Paige finally turned to look at Kevin. She didn't smile. She just watched him, like a scientist watching a bug trapped in amber. "Mr. Adams," the judge said, his voice booming now, "I suggest you take 5 minutes to explain to your client what reversionary interest means. Court is in recess." The gavel slammed down, sounding like a gunshot in the silent room. Kevin stared at Paige, the horror slowly dawning on him. It wasn't just a divorce case anymore. It was an eviction, and he was on the wrong side of the door. The recess was supposed to be 15 minutes. It stretched to 45. In the polished marble hallway outside Courtroom 4B, the air was thick with the scent of expensive cologne and panic. Brian Adams, the shark who had promised a slaughter, had lost his teeth. He was pacing furiously, his Italian leather shoes squeaking against the floor, barking into his phone at a junior paralegal back at his firm. "I don't care if the archives are dusty, Jenkins. Get me the county records from 1920 to 1930. Yes, all of them. I need a loophole in the Howard Trust. Search for easement exceptions, abandonment of claim, anything." Kevin Moore stood against the wall, pressing a cold water bottle to his forehead. He looked pale, the color of wet ash. He felt like he had been punched in the gut by a ghost. "How is this possible, Brian?" Kevin hissed, his voice trembling. "She's a librarian. She drives a Honda Civic with a dent in the bumper. She clips coupons for yogurt. How is she that?" Brian hung up the phone with a violent stab of his finger and whirled on his client. "She's not just a librarian, Kevin. She's a Howard. Do you know who the Howards are in this state? They aren't rich, like you think you're rich with your leased BMW and your leveraged portfolio. They're, we own the mountain the coal comes from, rich. They're old money, invisible money, the kind of money that builds libraries just to have a quiet place to read." "Why didn't she tell me?" Kevin asked, watching Paige and Erin Coleman standing calmly at the other end of the corridor, near the water fountain. Paige looked serene, almost bored, checking her watch. "Maybe she did," Brian snapped, loosening his tie. "Maybe you weren't listening, or maybe she knew you'd do exactly what you're doing now, trying to bleed her dry, so she kept the ultimate trump card in her back pocket." Kevin felt a wave of nausea. He thought back to the early days of their marriage. Paige had suggested a prenup. He had been offended, thinking she didn't trust his potential earnings. She had dropped it with a strange smile. He realized now that the prenup wasn't to protect his future assets. It was to protect him from the trust's wrath. "Fix this," Kevin demanded, his old arrogance trying to surface through the panic. "I am not losing that house. It's my portfolio's centerpiece. I have investors lined up to flip it next year. I leveraged the renovation costs against my commercial holdings. If I lose the title, the bank calls the loans on everything." Brian stopped pacing. He looked at Kevin, his eyes narrowing. "You leveraged the renovation? Does the bank know you don't hold the land title?" They assumed standard fee, simple ownership," Kevin stammered. "I might have streamlined the paperwork." Brian closed his eyes and exhaled slowly. "Kevin, if we lose this, you aren't just homeless. You're looking at fraud charges. We have to win. We have to break that trust." "How?" "We get dirty," Brian said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "The judge mentioned the morality clause, infidelity or abandonment. We flip the script. We argue that she abandoned the marriage emotionally. We argue that she entrapped you. We go with the unjust enrichment angle." "Unjust enrichment?" "We argue that she acted in bad faith," Brian explained, his eyes gleaming with a desperate, slimy light. "She allowed you to pour millions into her property, knowing she would revoke the title. That's a form of fraud. We paint her as a black widow who lured you in to renovate her ancestral home and then kicked you out. We sue for the value of the improvements plus damages." "Do it," Kevin said, smoothing his tie, desperate to believe the lie. "Destroy her." Across the hall, Erin Coleman watched them conspiring. "They're going to pivot to bad faith," she murmured to Paige. "They're going to say you set a trap. They'll try to paint you as a manipulator." Paige took a sip of water. "I didn't set a trap, Erin. I told him when we bought the lot that my family had a connection to it and we could get it for a nominal fee. He was so busy bragging to his friends about stealing the land for $1 that he never asked what the connection was. He signed the papers without reading the addendum." "I know," Erin said. "But be prepared. They're going to get nasty now. They have nothing left to lose." When court reconvened, the atmosphere had shifted. The air was heavier, charged with the static of imminent conflict. Judge Foster looked impatient, tapping his pen against the bench. He wanted to wrap this up, but Brian Adams came out swinging, his posture aggressive. "Your Honor," Brian began, his voice dripping with faux outrage as he approached the bench. "While the deed issues are complex, they point to a much darker reality. This was a premeditated long con by Mrs. Moore." Paige stiffened in her chair. "My client," Brian gestured to Kevin, who looked suitably victimized, shoulders slumped, head bowed, poured his life savings, his blood, sweat, and tears into building that home. Mrs. Moore sat back and watched him do it, knowing full well that this obscure 1922 clause existed. She withheld material facts. She deceived her husband. This isn't a property dispute. It is a calculated theft of equity. Judge Foster leaned back, his face unreadable. "Fraud requires intent to deceive, Mr. Adams. Do you have proof she hid this?" "We have the fact that she never mentioned being an heiress," Brian shouted, slamming his hand on the table. "And now she claims she wants the house. She is unstable, Your Honor. We have medical records indicating severe depression 3 years ago following a miscarriage. We believe this trauma led her to construct a fantasy where she punishes her husband. She is vindictive and mentally unfit to manage this estate." A murmur went through the courtroom. It was a low blow, a disgusting blow. Even the court reporter flinched. Paige stood up. Erin tried to stop her, but Paige placed a firm hand on Erin's shoulder. "Mrs. Moore," Judge Foster said, his eyes narrowing at Brian's display, "you are represented by counsel. You should let her speak." "I need to answer this myself, Your Honor," Paige said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried to the back of the room with a clarity that cut through the tension. "Mr. Adams is right about one thing. I was depressed 3 years ago." She turned to look at Kevin. Kevin refused to meet her eyes. He was staring at the table, looking smug, thinking the hysterical woman card was playing well. "I lost our daughter," Paige said, her voice trembling slightly but never breaking. "And the day I came home from the hospital, Kevin wasn't there to hold me. He was at a closing dinner for a commercial strip mall. He sent me a text message that said, 'Life goes on,' and that I shouldn't wallow because it made his investors uncomfortable." The courtroom went dead silent. "I didn't hide my name," Paige continued, turning back to the judge. "The land was a wedding gift from my grandmother, the matriarch of the Howard Trust. She gave us the leasehold rights for $1. Kevin signed the paper. The document was titled Leasehold Grant from Howard Trust to K. Moore and P. Howard. It was the first page of the closing packet. She picked up a document from her table. He didn't read it because he was too busy yelling at the notary to hurry up so he could make his tea time. He didn't know I was an heiress because I didn't want my money to define our marriage. I wanted to be loved for me. When I realized he only loved my utility, I stayed quiet. I let him build his castle because it was the only thing that kept him happy enough to leave me alone." "And now?" Judge Foster asked gently. "Now," Paige said, her voice turning to steel, "I am exercising the clause. Paragraph 4, Section B. In the event of marital dissolution, where the non-blood spouse has committed infidelity or abandonment, the lease is terminated immediately." Brian Adams froze. He scrambled through his papers. I don't see that." "It's in the 1922 addendum," Erin Coleman pointed out helpfully, sliding a paper across the table. "The morality clause. It's archaic, but it was never repealed. It defines abandonment not just physically, but moral abandonment." "Infidelity is hearsay," Brian shouted, desperation clawing at his throat. "You have no proof. A few dinners with a colleague is not adultery." Paige looked at the back of the courtroom. The heavy oak doors opened. A young woman walked in. She looked terrified, clutching her purse with white knuckles. It wasn't Molly Jenkins. It was Sarah Miller, the receptionist from Kevin's real estate firm, the woman who managed his schedule, his expenses, and his secrets. "I call Sarah Miller to the stand," Erin Coleman said. Kevin's face went from pale to grey. Sarah knew about the offshore accounts. Sarah knew about the hotels. But worse, Sarah knew about the bank documents. The testimony of Sarah Miller was not long, but it was an avalanche that buried Kevin Moore. She had been subpoenaed quietly by Erin Coleman weeks ago, faced with a choice between perjury and betraying a boss who underpaid her. Sarah chose self-preservation. She sat in the witness box, looking small. "Ms. Miller," Erin asked gently, "did you book travel for Mr. Moore and a Ms. Molly Jenkins?" "Yes," Sarah whispered. 5 times, to Cabo, Aspen, and Miami. He used the company credit card and told me to code it as client development." "And did Mr. Moore ever ask you to perform duties outside of your job description?" Sarah took a deep breath. She looked at Kevin, who was staring at her with wide, terrified eyes, silently pleading. She looked away. "Mr. Moore instructed me to forge Mrs. Moore's signature on a second mortgage application 3 months ago," Sarah said into the microphone. Judge Foster's eyebrows shot up into his hairline. The pen dropped from his hand. "Excuse me?" He wanted to pull equity out of the house to cover a bad investment in crypto," Sarah said, her voice gaining strength. "He practiced her signature on legal pads in his office. He told me to notarize it. I refused, so he found someone online who would do it for cash." Kevin stood up, knocking his chair over with a loud clatter. "She's lying. She's a disgruntled employee. I fired her for incompetence." "Sit down, Mr. Moore," Judge Foster barked. The sound cracked through the room like a gunshot. "One more outburst and I will hold you in contempt and have you removed in shackles." Kevin sank back down, hyperventilating. Bryan Adams had his face in his hands. He knew it was over. The morality clause in the trust was bad enough. That just meant losing the house. But bank fraud, forging a spouse's signature on a federally insured loan? That was prison time. "Ms. Coleman," Judge Foster said, his voice icy calm, "do you have this mortgage document?" "We acquired it from the bank this morning, Your Honor," Erin said, handing up a fresh file. "We were saving it for the rebuttal, but since Mr. Adams brought up bad faith, we felt it was relevant to show who was actually acting in bad faith." Judge Foster examined the signature. He looked at Paige's real signature on the affidavit. They were similar, but the pressure points were wrong. It was a clumsy forgery, done by a man who thought he was too smart to get caught. "Mr. Moore," the judge said, lowering the paper. He took off his glasses. "Not only does it appear you do not own the land this house sits on, but it also appears you have committed a felony to extract value from a structure you were rapidly losing claim to." Kevin looked at Bryan. "Do something," he hissed. "Object. Say it's inadmissible." Bryan Adams stood up slowly. He began packing his briefcase. "What are you doing?" Kevin whispered. "I'm withdrawing," Bryan said quietly, but loud enough for the microphone to catch. "I cannot represent a client who demands I suborn perjury and who has committed fraud without my knowledge. You're on your own, Kevin." Bryan walked out. He didn't look back. Kevin Moore sat alone at the defendant's table. The large, empty expanse of wood suddenly felt like a desert island. He looked across the aisle. Paige wasn't looking at him with anger anymore. She was looking at him with pity, and that hurt worse than the anger. Judge Foster cleared his throat. "Mr. Moore, you are currently unrepresented. I strongly suggest you find criminal counsel immediately. But as for this court, I have seen enough." The judge picked up his pen. "I am issuing a ruling from the bench. The court upholds the validity of the Howard Trust and the reversionary interest clause. The property at 12 Oakwood Lane, including all improvements and structures, is the sole property of the trust, administered by Paige Howard. Kevin put his head on the table. Furthermore, the judge continued, I am freezing all of Mr. Moore's assets, pending an investigation into the alleged bank fraud. And regarding the request for spousal support? The judge paused, looking at Paige. Mrs. Moore, did you request alimony? Paige stood. No, Your Honor. I don't want his money. I just want him off my land. Judge Foster nodded. Mr. Moore, you have 24 hours to vacate the premises. You are to take only personal clothing and toiletries. Anything purchased with marital funds stays until the audit is complete. The gavel came down. Bang! It was the sound of a life shattering. But the nightmare for Kevin Moore was only just beginning, because as he walked out of the courtroom, dazed and defeated, he saw the red light of a camera. A local YouTube investigative journalist named The Truth Hunter, tipped off by an anonymous source about a high-profile real estate fraud, shoved a microphone in his face. Mr. Moore, is it true you forged your wife's signature to buy crypto? Do you have any comment on the Howard Trust? Kevin swatted the camera away, his face twisted in rage. Get that camera out of my face. He didn't know it yet, but that reaction was the thumbnail that would launch 1 million views. Kevin Moore was about to go viral. Kevin Moore didn't just lose his house, he lost the narrative. And in the digital age, losing the narrative is a death sentence. The video clip of him storming out of the courthouse, face twisted in a rictus of rage as he shoved the camera held by the YouTuber The Truth Hunter, hit the platform at 4 p.m. By 8 p.m., it had crossed 500,000 views. By the next morning, it was the #1 trending video on the platform, under the hashtags #EstateFraudBro and #KarmaCourt. The internet is a cruel judge, far harsher and more creative than Nicholas Foster could ever be. Online sleuths, fueled by the palpable injustice of the story, dug into Kevin's past with terrifying efficiency. They found his old real estate listings, where he exaggerated square footage by rounding up to the nearest 1,000. They unearthed a cached version of a lifestyle blog he tried to start 3 years ago, the Alpha Blueprint, where he gave advice on how to dominate your partner financially to ensure loyalty. The breakdown videos were ruthless. Body language experts analyzed his shove outside the courthouse, dissecting his micro-expressions of entitlement. Legal Eagles on TikTok explained the reversionary interest clause to millions of teenagers, turning an obscure property law into a pop culture moment. But the final nail in the coffin came from the lifestyle he had tried so hard to curate. They found Molly Jenkins' Instagram. It was a goldmine of incriminating evidence, filled with photos of her posing in Paige's house, wearing Paige's jewelry, tagged #MyBestLife and #upgrade. The side-by-side comparisons of Molly wearing the vintage sapphire necklace Kevin claimed he couldn't afford to buy, back from the pawn shop for Paige's birthday, went viral instantly. At Justice for Paige commented, "Imagine cheating on a Howard, literal old money royalty, and thinking you won because you leased a BMW. This dude played checkers while she was playing 4D chess." At Karma Cop wrote, "The look on his face when the lawyer walked out? Chef's kiss. Also that shove? That's assault. I hope the DA is watching." Kevin was staying at a Motel 6 off the highway, a place that smelled of stale cigarette smoke and industrial cleaner. His credit cards were frozen. His leased BMW had been repossessed from the courthouse parking lot moments after the fraud investigation was announced, leaving him standing on the curb with a box of personal items and a garment bag. He sat on the lumpy mattress, the blue light of his phone illuminating his hollow face. He scrolled through the comments, unable to stop. It was a form of self-flagellation. He watched his reputation incinerate in real time. His phone rang. It was his boss, Gary, the owner of the brokerage firm. Kevin cleared his throat, trying to summon his closer voice. "Gary, listen, I know how this looks. It's all a misunderstanding. The lawyer screwed me up. I'm going to—" "Kevin, shut up!" Gary's voice was ice cold. "The FBI was here this morning. They seized your work laptop and your files. Do you have any idea what this does to my firm's reputation? Gary, please, you're fired. Effective immediately. And don't bother coming in for your personal effects. We boxed them up and left them with security. If you step foot on the property, we'll call the police. You are radioactive, Kevin. Lose this number." The line went dead. Hunger gnawed at him. He hadn't eaten in 24 hours. He pulled a baseball cap low over his eyes and walked across the parking lot to a 24-hour diner. He sat in the back booth, ordering a black coffee and toast. The waitress, a woman in her 50s with tired eyes, poured his coffee. She lingered for a moment, staring at him. Kevin kept his head down. "Say," she said, her voice dropping, "you look like that guy." Kevin froze. "What guy?" "That guy on the phone." She pointed to a teenager in the next booth, watching a video without headphones. Kevin heard his own voice screaming from the phone speaker. "Get that camera out of my face!" "No," Kevin whispered. "I just have one of those faces." "You sure do," the waitress said, not kindly. She slammed the coffee pot down. "That poor wife. My ex tried to take my trailer. I hope she takes you for everything." She walked away. Kevin left a crumpled $5 bill, his last cash, and ran out of the diner without drinking the coffee. Back in the motel room, he thought about calling Molly. She was the only one who might understand. She was his partner in crime, wasn't she? She had enjoyed the fruits of his fraud. He dialed her number, his thumb shaking. "The number you have dialed is no longer in service." Of course, Molly wasn't in love with Kevin. She was in love with the lifestyle Kevin provided. Without the platinum credit cards and the lakeside mansion, Kevin was just a middle-aged man with a pending prison sentence. She had ghosted him faster than he had discarded Paige. A heavy, suffocating silence filled the motel room, broken only by the sound of trucks passing on the highway. For the first time in his life, Kevin Moore cried. Not for his lost marriage or for the pain he caused, but for the realization that he was exactly what he accused Paige of being, a nobody. While Kevin's world was contracting into a prison of his own making, Paige's world was expanding. She stood on the back deck of the house at 12 Oakwood Lane. The sun was setting over the lake, casting long shadows across the water. The house was quiet. The toxic energy Kevin had brought into it, the frantic need to impress, the loud parties where he interrupted everyone, the shallow conversations about crypto and golf, was gone. Erin Coleman stood beside her, holding 2 mugs of herbal tea. "The locks are changed," Erin said, checking a list on her tablet. "And the security system has been updated. If he tries to come within 500 feet, the police are automatically notified. We also filed a restraining order based on the threats he made in the courthouse hallway." "He won't come back," Paige said softly, watching a heron take flight from the reeds. "He's too proud. He'd rather sleep in the woods than let me see him defeated. He might not have a choice regarding the sleeping arrangements," Erin noted dryly. "I heard the repo trucks were busy today. The grapevine says he's at the Motel 6 off I-90. Paige took a sip of the tea. She looked out at the massive oak tree near the waterline, the tree her grandfather Elijah had planted 90 years ago. Kevin had wanted to cut it down because it blocked 5% of the view from the master bedroom. He called it dirty lumber, and had actually hired a tree service to remove it while Paige was visiting her mother. She had come home just in time to stand in front of the chainsaw. It was one of the few times she had truly fought him. "What will you do with the place?" Erin asked, looking back at the sprawling mansion. "It's a lot of house for one person. The upkeep alone, the heating, the grounds." "I'm not staying here," Paige said, surprising her lawyer. "Not like this." She turned and walked back into the house, her heels clicking on the imported Italian marble. Marble Kevin had screamed at her for scratching once. She walked into the man cave, a room Kevin had soundproofed so he could play video games and watch stocks without distractions. It was filled with leather furniture, a humidor, and framed pictures of himself shaking hands with minor local celebrities. Paige walked over to the wall and pulled down a framed photo of Kevin posing with a leased Ferrari. She dropped it into the trash bin. The glass shattered. It was a satisfying sound. "This house, the way it looks now? It's a monument to Kevin's ego," Paige said. "The gold fixtures, the wine cave he never stocked, the mirrored ceilings. It's not me, it never was. It feels like a museum of narcissism." "So you'll sell? You could get $3 million, easily. The market is hot." "No," Paige smiled, a genuine expression that lit up her face, erasing years of worry lines. "I can't sell, remember? The trust. My grandfather didn't preserve this land so I could flip it for a profit." She turned to Erin, her eyes bright with a new purpose. "I'm going to turn it into a transitional shelter for women leaving financially abusive marriages. I'm going to call it the Elijah House." Kevin wanted this place to be a symbol of exclusive wealth, a place to keep people out. I'm going to make it a symbol of inclusive safety, a place to bring people in. Erin stared at her client. She had seen many women post-divorce, some bitter, some broken, some relieved, but she had rarely seen one so empowered. "That is poetic justice?" Erin whispered. "It's not justice," Paige corrected, her voice firm. "It's responsibility. I have this name, this land, this privilege. I hid from it for too long because I wanted a simple life. But hiding allowed a predator like Kevin to thrive. I'm done hiding." The renovation began 2 weeks later. Paige didn't hire a fancy design firm. She hired local contractors, specifically looking for woman-owned businesses. She sledgehammered the wine cave herself, turning the cool, dark space into a sensory calm-down room for children. The man cave became the legal aid office. The master suite was divided into 3 comfortable private apartments for families in immediate crisis. Paige went public with her plan on a local talk show. She wore a simple blazer and spoke clearly. She didn't trash Kevin. She didn't even mention his name. She talked about financial literacy for women. She talked about the signs of coercive control, the restricted access to accounts, the gaslighting about spending, the isolation. She became a hero not because she destroyed her ex, but because she built a fortress from the rubble of his destruction. The courtroom was different this time. It wasn't the warm wood and local intimacy of family court. It was the cold steel, fluorescent light, and imposing federal seal of the district court. Kevin Moore stood before a federal judge wearing an orange jumpsuit instead of a bespoke suit. He looked 10 years older. His hair was thinning rapidly, his skin was sallow from lack of sunlight, and the arrogance that had defined his existence was gone, replaced by a twitchy, rodent-like nervousness. He had pleaded guilty to 2 counts of bank fraud and 1 count of wire fraud. Brian Adams, his former shark lawyer, had testified against him in a plea deal to save his own law license. It turned out Kevin had lied to Brian, too, implicating the lawyer in the fraud without his consent. Brian's testimony was the final dagger. Paige sat in the back row. She didn't have to be there. Erin had told her she could stay home. But Paige felt she needed to see the end of the story to truly close the book. She needed to see the period at the end of the sentence. The prosecutor, a sharp woman with glasses, stood up. "Your Honor, Mr. Moore's actions were driven by greed and a profound sense of entitlement. He defrauded a financial institution, yes, but he also attempted to defraud his spouse, a woman who had supported him for years. He treated the law as a suggestion and people as disposable assets to be leveraged and liquidated." "Mr. Moore," the judge said, peering down at him over reading glasses, "do you have anything to say?" Kevin stood up. His hands were shackled to his waist. He looked at the floor. I just wanted to be successful," Kevin mumbled. "I thought if I had the things, the house, the car, I would be someone." "You were someone," the judge said sternly. "You were a husband. You were a citizen. You traded those titles for inmate. I sentence you to 36 months in federal prison, followed by 5 years of probation. You are also ordered to pay restitution in the amount of $450,000. The gavel banged. It didn't sound like a victory. It sounded like a heavy door closing. As the marshals led Kevin away, the chains on his ankles rattling with a grim rhythm, he turned. He scanned the gallery, desperate for a friendly face. He found none. No Molly, no business partners, no friends. But then his eyes locked on Paige. He paused. The marshal tugged his arm, impatient. Kevin looked at her, really looked at her for the first time in years. He saw the strength he had mistaken for weakness. He saw the dignity he had tried to strip away. He mouthed 2 words. "You won." Paige looked at him, her face calm, void of malice. She didn't smile. She just shook her head slightly and mouthed back, "I survived." She watched him disappear through the side door. It was over. The man who had made her feel small for a decade was now just a number in the Bureau of Prisons database. Paige walked out of the courthouse. The air was crisp. Fall had arrived, painting the city in shades of gold and amber. She got into her Honda. She still drove it. She liked it. It was reliable, and drove toward the lake. When she pulled into the driveway of 12 Oakwood Lane, the house was buzzing with activity. It didn't look like a fortress anymore. It looked like a home. There were flower pots on the steps. A tricycle was overturned on the lawn. A young woman was sitting on the front porch steps, holding a battered suitcase, looking terrified. She had a bruise on her cheek and a toddler clinging to her leg, hiding his face in her denim skirt. Paige parked the car and walked up the path. The young woman looked up, flinching slightly, her eyes darting around as if expecting an attack. "Hi," Paige said gently, stopping a few feet away to give her space. "I'm Paige. You're safe here." I don't have any money," the woman whispered, her voice cracking. "My husband, he controlled everything. He said I'd never make it on my own. He said the judge would never believe me." Paige felt a familiar ache in her chest, but it wasn't pain anymore. It was empathy. "I know," Paige said, offering a genuine, warm smile that reached her eyes. "I've been there. He was wrong, and you don't need money to be here." The woman looked at the massive house, then back at Paige. "Why? Why do you do this?" Paige looked up at the oak tree, standing tall and unbending against the wind. "Because someone has to hold the deed to the truth," Paige said. "Come inside. Let's get you some tea." As they walked through the front door, the sunlight hit the new brass plaque Paige had just installed by the entrance. It didn't say, "The Moore Estate." It read, "The Elijah House. Established 1922. Reclaimed 2024. Kevin Moore wanted a trophy wife and a trophy house, but he forgot that trophies are inanimate objects, and people are not. He underestimated the quiet librarian, never realizing that the strongest trees have the deepest roots. In the end, Kevin lost everything: his freedom, his reputation, and his ego, while Paige turned her pain into a sanctuary for others. It's a brutal reminder that when you try to bury someone, you better make sure they aren't a seed. If you enjoyed this story of justice served cold, hit that like button and subscribe for more tales of karma catching up to those who deserve it. Share this video with someone who needs to be reminded that the truth always comes out in the deed. Thanks for watching.